Right. So as Al said, I am a freelance photographer, and I was recently in the Yukon shooting the Yukon Quest, which I'll talk about in a minute. But first, I want to talk about how I ended up there. I'm originally from Arizona, so I'm far more used to seeing sand dunes than mountains covered in snow. So when I was finishing my degree this past fall, I had seen something that Al had retweeted saying photographer needed for subarctic expedition. I had no experience on expeditions. I'd never been to the Arctic and I knew nothing about sled dog racing, but I thought, sure, why not? Let's go for it. What I did have was a love for adventure, and living in Northern Ireland the past 2 years, just exploring the wilderness and being outside there. And I really found a love for taking photographs and trying to sort of capture the essence and excitement of adventure. So I applied to this tweet, and 2 months later, I ended up in the Arctic. This is the moment I realized that if I closed my eyes for too long, my eyelashes started to freeze together. That was kind of like a welcome to Alaska moment. But I went in not knowing anything about sled dog racing or the Yukon Quest. So I just kind of tried to soak up as much as I could as quickly as possible. So here's a crash course for you guys on the Yukon Quest. It's a 1,000-mile international sled dog race where you have a musher and their sled. The sleds can weigh up to 250 pounds, and it has all their food and provisions to get them from checkpoint to checkpoint. And these are pulled by typically 12 to 14 dogs. Going in, I'm thinking this is really simple. It's just a guy on a sled being pulled by dogs. How complicated can it be? But in reality, there's so much more to it. And it's such a huge part of the culture up in the north. Everyone has seemingly been a musher before, and everyone was involved and excited about this Yukon Quest. The trail itself is 1,000 miles, which is roughly the distance from England to Africa. And it follows the historic Klondike Gold Rush Trail and some of the historic mail delivery routes. So it's kind of part of their history and culture as well. This is from the start line, which was about minus 25 Fahrenheit, which was the coldest that I've ever been in. And trying to shoot this as a photographer was terrifying because there was these dogs running super fast. I'm wearing this cold weather gear and you can't move at all. So it was really an adventure for me in that sense. But I learned two things quite quickly. Number one, that mushers are incredibly interesting people. They have really great stories and a huge love for being outdoors and adventuring. And two, that sled dogs are really hardcore. They're not abused and overworked. They really are elite athletes and love to be running on the trails. So basically, after they leave the start line here in Fairbanks, they went through a series of 10 checkpoints across the wilderness and ended up in Whitehorse in the Yukon. This is the first checkpoint. So my job as a photographer was to work as a part of a team following these mushers along the trail, meeting them at the checkpoints, and shooting photographs and videos of them here and while they were on the trail to sort of share with the world that couldn't be there. So it was a really unique opportunity for me to sort of be up close and personal and really see sort of the behind the scenes of the quest. So typically they would run 6 hours and then sleep 6 hours, and obviously that would change depending on the team and the time that they were running. But, sorry. Yeah, so they would come in at really weird times of night and have really bizarre sleeping schedules. And they would come in saying things like they had hallucinated seeing a giant toaster in the middle of the frozen lake, or started yelling at a fence post to move out of the way because they thought it was a moose. So you get really interesting stories from these guys. But I think one of my favorite things about the quest is that it's one of the few sports where you have young and old competing at the top of their field. So this is Christy Barrington, who I think was one of the youngest female mushers, all the way up to people who are in their 50s or 60s and have been running it for years. So it's really that they've run this race because it's what they're passionate about and what they love to be doing. Another thing that I really loved about the quest was the people that you meet along the way. Some really interesting characters and some people with some really great beards. They look really cool when they're frozen and icy as well. But anyways, I even met a guy who, his name was Harvey, and he had great stories of just going out with his dogs. These are his dogs. And he even let me take them out and go for a mush myself, which ultimately ended with me face planting in a snowbank. But no one was hurt, and so it made for a really good story. But anyways, some of the stuff that these mushers encounter along the trail, it's the 1,000 miles, and they go through 4 mountains, which are quite significant mountains to get over. And then the tricky part is actually coming back down and not crashing your sled into your dogs, obviously. Frozen rivers and jumble ice and snowbanks and lots of crazy, hectic, harsh weather. This past year, it wasn't as cold as it had been in the past, but that made it tricky in other ways, that the rivers were starting to thaw out, leaving overflow in water, which is kind of scary and dangerous. But the Yukon Quest is very much about the spirit of the North and being out and adventuring in the wilderness. But having said that, it is also a race. And so the mushers are trying to get, obviously, to the finish line as fast as possible while taking care of their dogs and sort of enjoying it along the way. So this is Alan Moore leaving the last checkpoint, which is about 60 miles from the finish line. So 9.5 days after they left the start line, we were waiting at the finish line. We weren't really sure who was going to win because this is Hugh Neff. He left 2 hours after Alan Moore. So we're waiting in the dark, and we see 2 headlights coming in towards us, literally right behind each other. And it ended up being the closest finish in the history of the race, with Hugh Neff winning by 26 seconds, which is incredible for a 1,000-mile race. But all in all, these mushers really are being on the trail is what they really love to do under the beautiful Yukon sky. And you can tell that they're so passionate about it. And for me to experience that as a photographer was an incredible opportunity. So even if you have no experience in something, if you're excited or passionate about it, you should go for it, because you never know what adventure may follow.